Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another question and answer video. This week's question comes from Ahmed, who asks about the story of Abrahah and the elephant. Thank you, Ahmed. I've received several emails during this last year asking about Abrahah, so let's do a short video about him. And let's address some of the questions that come out of this story. Remember, the study of Yemeni history is a specialized study, and there are many unique things about Yemen. It's also a relatively unexplored part of the world. Only a few archaeological digs have taken place, and much of what we know comes from surface finds. So our first question is, was Abrahah a real person? Well, a number of Abrahah inscriptions have been found in Yemen and southern Arabia. I'm not sure how many there are, but each of them are named and numbered. The largest Abrahah inscription is known as CIH 541. It describes a rupture in the Great Marab Dam and its repair and other historical events around 541 AD. In other videos, I've talked about the Marab Dam and why it was important to Islam, so we won't address it here. Another Abrahah inscription is found in the vicinity of the well of Muragan. It is about a military excursion into Arabia against the tribe of Mad. Places are not really mentioned, just the names of tribes. After conquering the tribes, Abrahah returned back to Yemen. The date given corresponds to 552 AD. Another Abrahah inscription is known as DIA GDN 2002-20, comes from the Marab Dam. It was discovered just laying in the sand close to the dam in 2004. It's a limestone column, and it's inscribed on all four sides. It talks about the construction of the north sluice for the dam around 548 AD. But what is of interest to us is yet another Abrahah inscription. This is an undated inscription called Reichmann's 506, in which Abrahah goes on yet another expedition into Central Arabia. On the way he reaches Yathrib, or Medina. This is probably the actual expedition of Abrahah with his army and his elephant. Although it's undated, Professor Kister concluded that this event took place around 552 AD, while according to Dr. Robbins' analysis, it should be dated to shortly after 558 AD. Regardless of the actual date, there is no doubt that there was a Yemeni ruler known as Abrahah, and that he sent an excursion north from Yemen into Arabia. It is now accepted that much of Arabia was under the control of Yemen for at least 10 years and perhaps much, much longer. This is why Yemen plays such an important role in the early years of Islam. Now, Abrahah had some kind of Christian faith, and he built a church in Sana'a in Yemen. The Greek word here used to describe it is ecclesia, or just a church. Some of the early texts do not call it anything other than a church, but later on some of the texts call it a cathedral, and some describe it as a great building and so forth. Abrahah, after he built this church, he tried to convince the local Yemenis to worship there, but they wanted to go north and to worship at something called the Kaaba. Eventually, a Canaanite man came down to the church, and he went into it and he defiled it with dung. And Abrahah responded with anger, and he swore he would destroy this Kaaba building. Now, in the Islamic account, Abrahah marches north out of Yemen, and he conquers some tribes along the way, all the way up to Medina. And from there, he continues marching on to Mecca. Now, according to the archaeological record that we have studied, the only Mecca at this time was the first Mecca, known today as Petra, in the city of Jordan. Up until this time, there were no mosques facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and there's no archaeological record that there was much of anything in the Saudi location at this time. Now, when Abrahah approaches the city, and that would be the city of Petra approaching from the south, Muhammad's grandfather tried to negotiate with him, but in the end, the people withdrew from the city. Ibn Hisham tells us the people took up defensive positions on the mountain heights and in the passes of the mountains, or the thaniyas, for they were afraid of the soldiers. The term mountain heights and the thaniyas in the mountain is more reminiscent of Petra than of Mecca. Mecca's mountains are several kilometers from the Kaaba. Well, I remember in the early days when I heard that story and looking at photos of Mecca, I wondered how could the people look down from the mountain heights and see clearly what was happening, because it's so far away. But in Petra, it was common for people to gather in the mountains and when an enemy attacked, because they were protected by these massive cliffs. From the top of the cliffs, they could look right down onto the Kaaba building, almost below them. It was almost also possible for the people on the mountains to throw rocks down onto the people in the valleys below them, or to use small catapults to rain rocks onto the enemy below. This doesn't seem possible in Mecca because of the distance, but it's very possible in Petra with the high cliffs that surround the valley where the city is in the middle. And the Kaaba building, as we know it today, was right close to the cliffs of some of the mountains there. The next day, Abrahah prepared to enter the area, and he made his great elephant ready for battle. This is described as a very large elephant, the size of which people had never seen before. When it came time to attack, the elephant refused to move. In the end, the army was crushed by rocks, and they fled. And it appears on their way back to Yemen, they were also struck with some sort of terrible disease. Many of them died, and some commentators think it might have been smallpox. Now, that's a very quick overview from Ibn Hisham's, the oldest account that we have of this story. I didn't give the details because many of the details are in question. For instance, Ibn Sa'd, writing some 200 years after Muhammad, tells us the story, but in his account there are 13 elephants. So the number of elephants has grown over the years. Now, there are several questions people ask. For instance, they might ask, what kind of elephant is it? Now, there are three possible answers that we could have. It could have been an Asian elephant from somewhere near India. The Asian elephants were used by Alexander the Great and his generals up in Europe. They saw these elephants in India when they were there. They brought elephants back with them. This elephant is much smaller and has quite small ears, and it has a temperament that allows it to be quite well tamed and controlled. But Abrahah's elephant could not have been an Asian elephant because it was described as being very large. Now, there also was a North African elephant, and there is an African elephant. So there's two kinds of elephants in Africa. Each of these have different characteristics. The North African elephant is now extinct, but it was the kind of elephant that was used by Hannibal when he attacked Rome. These are the elephants that were in the plains around Carthage, and they tamed them and they used them in their army. What records we have show that the North African elephant, it was smaller as well, like the Asian elephant. In the case of Abrahah's elephant, it's described as very large, which gives us the idea that perhaps it was an African elephant. These elephants were not only very large in size, they also had very large ears. The African elephant had a reputation for being stubborn and not being very well tamed, and so it had a mind of its own. While it was very large, it was not considered reliable for battle, as it was difficult to control in the noise and the distractions of a battle. That is why I think Abrahah's elephant was most likely an African elephant. Besides, the African elephant is very adapted to desert life. That brings us to another issue. How did they bring an elephant all the way from Yemen up to Petra? It seems very far, and the deserts are very severe. Now, there are several things we need to consider. First, this story took place around 550 AD. That's about 1,500 years ago. The deserts of Arabia at that time were not nearly as severe as they are today. One of the ways of checking this is looking at the art that was drawn 1,000 years ago in Arabia. Both the Umayyads and the Byzantines record hunting wild animals from hunting lodges. The deserts back then were often more like grasslands than they were like the deserts we know today. So, do I think it was possible to take a single grass-eating elephant from Yemen up to Petra? Yes, I do. I think it's very possible that the Abrahah brought his elephant up to the south of Petra. Then there's the question of the birds. The Quran in Surah 105, which is the elephant, al-fil, speaks of this event, but the text of the Quran doesn't mention much about the elephant. Here's the text. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the companions of the elephant? Did he not turn their plans into misguidance? And he sent against them birds in flocks, striking them with stones of hard clay, and he made them like eaten straw. So, the Quran speaks about these great flock of birds that came over the battlefield. Now, today we have records that go back of flocks of migrating swallows that were flying over the Middle East, and years ago, some of these flocks would come by as many as 100,000 birds at a time. So you could imagine the terror that would come in the middle of battle when everything's going on, and suddenly the sky turns dark with this huge flapping of wings of all of these birds come across the battlefield. I'm sure it was very memorable to the armies that were there. It's not clear whether the birds struck Abrahah's army with stones, or if the birds just flew over while the stones were being thrown down from the cliffs onto the army. But in time, later writers made it out that the birds dropped the stones. In any case, Abrahah fled and returned back to Yemen. On the way, many of his soldiers suffered from a plague, and returning to Yemen, Abrahah died from this same plague. The reason why this story is important and why it is remembered is because this was the very year that both Muhammad and Ali were born. They were born in what is called the Year of the Elephant. Now, I want to point out one last thing, and it relates to the inscriptions that are in Yemen. This kind of thing may only be of interest to historians, but it gives you an idea of some of the other topics that can be drawn from Abrahah's story. In the inscriptions written before Abrahah traveled, the inscriptions always start in the name of Rahmanan and his son. This is an Ethiopian Christian type of opening, giving God the title of Rahman and then mentioning his son Jesus. But after Abrahah's travels up to Petra, he writes, in the name of Rahmanan and his Messiah. Now this is a very different opening, and it's very similar to the Christology of the Eastern Syrian Church. Now, historians have argued over this since the 1960s, but what is of importance here is that once we identify Petra as the location of the Kaaba at the time of Abrahah, we have a direct link between the Eastern Syrian churches around Petra and King Abrahah of Yemen. Did Abrahah's visit to the Kaaba bring him in contact with Eastern Christianity as it was around Petra? Is this why the terms used in the inscriptions changed? If so, it may be another indicator that Abrahah went all the way to Petra, and there he came in contact with Eastern theology. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another question and answer video.